So the reason these classic songs, the Fish Hawk, are so important is valuable to us is that we should know that Confucius loved them. Master Kong loved the old stuff. He had an enormous encyclopedic knowledge of the classics. He revered them. And they really became part and parcel of his teaching. He had such mastery. Now, that's kind of interesting, right? Jesus of Nazareth had mastery over the scriptures, his Jewish scriptures. He knew Genesis, he knew Exodus, he knew Leviticus, he knew Deuteronomy, he knew Torah by heart. He owned it. And Jesus then was upset and argued with these Pharisees, these scribes, these priests of the time who he thought weren't teaching what the Torah really wanted to teach. They were getting caught up in legalistic battles rather than the heart of goodness that he thought needed to be shared. Which, what happens? Everyone gets all legalistic and they forget the real meaning of the words. Well, here over in China, long before this debate is going on with Jesus and his Pharisees, well, we have Kong, who has a very different relationship with the classics. He just loves them, and he thinks they have wisdom, and he also delights in the power of the language. We do not get a sense in the English of the beauty of these repetitions in the classical Chinese. All of those repetitions, watercress picking, it's beautiful in the classical Chinese. And so the clarity, the beauty, the precision, the possibility of language to be precise and expressive is a really important part of the Confucian sensibility, that language can be that it can be minimal and clear, and that it also can have expressive in its minimism, in its elegance, in its concision. So here we have this guy Kong. Let's go back to Kong. Born in 551 into this middle class family, becomes a very successful sort of government official, and it's the early times. There's a dukedom, but there's 3 families in the dukedom that are fighting. It's very complex. There's lots of politics, and he very successfully gets in there. He sort of works, in the White House, arguing and helping and turning, and then somebody else comes in power, and then Trump storms the Capitol, and then there's a flip, and he was all caught up in the very kind of political wrangling that we have right now in Washington with the 3 families and the dukedom that he was. So he had a lot of experience with the political and governmental maneuvering, how people were fighting for power, and a belief that the right leader should be a virtuous leader. So his teachings were really focused on what a virtuous leader looks like and how you get there. So he did all of this. Then he started teaching how he believed, and he gathered followers. He gathered students who just adored him and followed him. And then, after a bunch of years, he got exiled, because don't all the great teachers get thrown out at some point? He was thrown out. Spent about 10 or 15 years wandering around northern China. He was 50 or 60 years old, about my age. Imagine if I were wandering around the Northeast, Connecticut, New Hampshire, and New York, and I'm picking up crowds of students all over the place who were eager to follow me, leave their families, learn everything that they could. And he was a devoted and cheery teacher. He loved his students. He loved teaching and sharing what he thought were principles for living a virtuous life, a life that was right, that was powerful, that was full, and that would lead to stability and order in his world. The political time was very tumultuous, and he believed he had a sort of a nostalgic fantasy for back in the times of the poems that he loved. He imagined a China that was more calm and stable. And in all of the unrest that he was experiencing directly with the fighting tribe, fighting feudal houses, fighting families, he really believed that if we could cultivate leaders with enough ren, with enough virtue, that's what would bring calm, stability, and good living for all that were there. That was his mission. So different, right? Jesus was like, he was a revolutionary. Jesus of Nazareth wanted to turn upside down the Pharisees, scribes. And he also wanted to the Jews weren't that big of a group. He was mad at the Pharisees, and he was mad at the Roman Empire. He wanted to turn up the Roman Empire so that people could be people could be fed, so that they could be loved, so that the poor could. He was really like a social justice revolutionary. And Kong, by contrast, was a teacher. He saw a lot of problems in the tumult, but he was also really kind of a conservative. He was kind of using the power of that old poetry to talk about a virtuous way of living, as if we could simply educate people into calm and right living. When he died, about 72, he had a group of devoted followers that numbered about 70. And they were very devout, and they talked amongst themselves, and they argued about what he said, and they told all the stories that he had said again and again. And then just like forever, about 100 years later, within 100 or 200 years, the speakings of Confucius started getting written down. So like with the Gospels, he didn't write anything. We can't trust any of the Analects as really being Master Kong's words. They are the words as remembered and passed down a generation or two after the man lived, circulated, refined, polished by the concerns of the time, and that's what we have as the Analects. And the Analects have become a part of this, quote, Confucian corpus, this collection of great texts that followers of Confucianism, practicing Confucianists, consult and think of, not exactly as scripture, because they don't elevate Confucius as to a god. They don't worship Confucius, but as really super, super, super honored texts. The text through which we understand the way to live a good life. So, we now have a religious or spiritual tradition called Taoism, which is, what Confucius says. And there are Taoist priests and shrines, and I'm not an expert on the Eastern religions, but we do. So we have this. Confucius isn't worshipped like a god. But the teachings of Confucius, just like the teachings of Jesus, and just like the teachings of Plato, of Socrates, are revered, are followed, are treated as if they were so important, so true, so right that they create a foundation for which people can live their lives. Foundational texts in a particular tradition. So what are the Analects? So the Analects are a collection, a remembered collection of teachings of Confucius, of teachings of Master Kong. And you have a selection, you have a great translation. I'm going to suggest that you read, maybe read the introduction if you're interested. You'll get a little bit of background. Maybe read the first couple books, 1, 2, 3, 4, to get an idea. The students ask questions, and Master Kong gives an answer. There's this back and forth call and response. It's interesting to compare it to the Gospel of Mark, which again is a little bit later and in a different part of the world, but you still have this back and forth form, this attempt to write a conversation as a way of learning and expressing knowledge. At the end of this translation, I think I've also added 2 other things. One, just really helpful, just a list of Confucian sayings, a real accessible couple pages of the good ones. I love them. I think there's just a couple of them. I think this one great. I'll read a couple to you. I just love this one. The noble-minded are calm and steady. Little people are forever fussing and fretting. This is one of my great. Never give a sword to a man who can't dance. That's very good advice. Very good advice. You can't dance, you don't have enough coordination if you use a sword. There's one other ones that I thought. You can look at the list yourself. I love this one. This is for when all you guys who are worried about being in the right major and going to the right school and getting the right job. Right? Here's what Confucius, his advice for you. Care not for want of place. Don't care about a job or your major or getting any of those. Don't care about that so much. Care for the readiness to fill one. Care not for being unknown, but seek to be worthy of note. I just think that is such great advice. Don't worry so much about getting a job. Worry about skills. Worry about being ready for the job when it appears. Don't worry so much about if your major's the right major. Worry about the skills that you're building, the readiness that you're cultivating. Are you learning how to read well? Is your critical thinking getting exercised? Is your writing skill developing, getting exercise and getting easier and more confident about it? How about your speaking skills? How are you feeling with the vocabulary of the field? Can you explain to somebody what you're doing at school? This is a readiness that gets you ready. Who knows what jobs are going to be available in a year or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5. I certainly am not in a career that I was preparing for, but I was preparing skills that got me where I was going. So I've just had 5 or 6 conversations with you guys this week about, should I change my major and should I go to Southern or should I go out of state? And it's not the time to think of that. It's the time to think about exercising your time management, your critical thinking, your kindness, your generosity, cultivating your spirit, keeping yourself whole, feeding yourself well, building your strength and your flexibility. That's what your work is in school. And if you attend to that which you have control over, Confucius says all of the rest will be fine. And my experience confirms that. We'll talk later about job and career paths. But my experience really confirms that. Like, oh my goodness, this is really good advice from then. Good advice to me from 500 BCE in China. And it rings true to Captain Kirk's life experience in 2021. That's amazing to me. That's suggesting that there's something in antique texts. As much as things have changed, as different as languages and cultures are, there still are these emotional truths, these psychological truths, these relationship truths or advice that were coming into articulation in these times that have incredible resonance with me today. Our species has not changed in many, many, many ways, even as much as our lives seem to have. My husband just went like, I can't believe life without computers. I can't. I'm on the screen for 6 hours a day, and he really is. But that's the second part of his life. He really was screen free for the first half of his life, as was I. I was screen free up until I was 25 years old. So we have psychologies. We have habits of mind that predate the screen. You guys don't. You guys have grown up with Wikipedia and your iPhones and so on and so forth. But this advice from Confucius from 500 BCE still seems to hold true. So I think you're really going to enjoy these. It's an easy read. You don't have to read the whole Analects. You're in charge of your reading and your knowledge. Give the attention that you think it is due. Let your curiosity be your guide. I think the little Goodreads, if you want a quick little scan and catch, you've got a bunch of Analects on a bunch of like wisdom sayings on that extra document. If you want to get a sense of how he taught, of the questions that he asked, of the tip and the turn, then dive in. I mean, I think I read through the first four books this morning, and I can't even remember how many books there are. But you certainly don't have to read the whole one. It's a great translation, and there's a couple weird things, you know. Not only did he study, you know, archery and chariotry and calligraphy, but there are these terms that show up that the translator just kind of couldn't deal with. So we have Li, Ren, Dao, and Junsi. And these four terms, if you're using the Indiana State University translation, he doesn't even try. He just goes ahead and puts the Chinese term. So what is that term? They're so important. Well, a rough translation of Li is, it kind of means ritual and rite and sort of using the right technique. So Li is the right technique, the proper ritual, the proper reverence, the proper respect. But it has to do with sort of technical ritual and technique. Ren is the biggie. And Ren is what he's really interested in cultivating. It loosely translates into goodness and virtue. The work is to become a virtuous person. And virtue for Confucius, virtue for Master Kong, includes being serious, being generous, being sincere, being diligent or hardworking, and being kind. These are the components of Ren, which is, it's, you know, great virtues. But the ones that are particularly interesting, you know, generosity is certainly consistent with, with Jesus. The meek shall inherit the earth. Feed the poor. Give of your time, your attention, your kindness. Be kind. You know, sincerity has a quality in Jesus's life. He speaks with authority. When he preaches with a kind of authority. He's not just saying the words like all those Pharisees. There's something different. There's a kind of power or sincerity in Jesus that I guess the story tells us is part of his godness. But this notion of sincerity, that's interesting. I'm not so sure that that's shared that much in the Gospel of Mark. Kindness certainly is. We see kindness in the Gospel of Mark in all kinds of ways. All kinds of people. Doesn't matter how high or how low you are. Jesus of Nazareth will give you his attention in ways that sometimes seem even disrespectful or irresponsible or confusing because it's so out of the norm. But seriousness, diligence, seriousness, as if the opposite of being serious is being frivolous or fun-loving or wasting. So this notion that virtue, the virtuous person, has a serious, something we use the term gravitas in Latin, a certain seriousness, as if this matters, as if things in life matter. It's not just all a trivial game. Our choices matter. That's a very powerful Confucian value, virtue, explanatory power, hardworking, and kindness. There's a kind of, it's important to be kind. So those, now what's interesting to me is that I don't really see diligence and seriousness in some of my, certainly not in some of the other traditions. Odysseus wasn't about being serious. He was tricky and clever, and he wasn't very kind. He didn't really watch out. I mean, if you look at the whole Odyssey, he was kind of a prick to all of his sailors. He just didn't care that much about them. It was all about me, and getting home to Ithaca and my Penelope. So those, it's not that that the virtues of the Greek world are bad or aren't. It's just how interesting that some of these other virtues aren't even part of that worldview. But when we come into the world of Master Kong, we have this brevity of the classics, of the classic poems. We have this detailed attention to the natural world, its beauty and the way it's organizing. We have a delight in the right terms of choosing correct terms for things. My English professor just loves that. I'm not aware of this precision attention to right choice of word in other traditions. It's very, very prominent in the Confucian writing, the Confucian way of being. The absolute value on hard work, on diligence, on attentiveness to the things that we're doing, of not doing anything mindlessly, but doing it mindfully. So in all of our contemporary talks about mindfulness, being present in the moment, taking a deep breath for now, there really is a great amount of resonance, of echo of that mindfulness talk of now to this very old Confucian mindset and teaching. So I ask you to delight in the Analects by Confucius. Read them through. I think maybe I'll throw a Confucian quiz, just so that for those of you who do the work of reading, you can get the quick little 10 points for understanding those terms and spending some time in that world. And then I don't think I'm going to ask you to do a scholar's notebook on Confucius, but there is an odd discussion board coming up. So come back. I have one more mini lecture for you, and that's about this week's discussion board.